The sliding glass door stood slightly open that May night in 1990, letting warm Florida air drift through the Courtyards complex in Cape Coral. Inside, 11-year-old Robin Cornell finished her homework while Lisa Story, her mother's trusted roommate, prepared for bed. By morning, both would be dead, suffocated in their beds by an intruder who vanished like morning mist over the Gulf Coast. For 31 years, their killer walked free. Evidence sat preserved in climate-controlled storage while technology evolved and databases expanded. The community moved forward, but some wounds never heal. Mothers still checked locks twice. Children grew up hearing whispered warnings about strangers in the night. Then, in 2021, a routine domestic arrest in Lee County triggered a computer match that would resurrect the dead and force a reckoning with time itself. DNA doesn't lie, even when memories fade. Sometimes justice sleeps, but it never dies. What took so long to catch a killer hiding in plain sight? Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Courtyards complex as Jan Cornell checked her watch one final time. 5 o'clock meant the start of another hospital shift, another night of saving lives while trusting others to protect what mattered most to her. The townhouse felt peaceful. Robin's backpack sat by the door, homework spread across the dining table, the familiar sounds of suburban Florida drifting through open windows. Lisa Story emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She had moved in just months earlier, a reliable presence who understood the delicate balance of single motherhood and shift work. Her calm demeanor made Jan's evening departures easier, knowing Robin would be safe until morning. "I'll probably be back around midnight," Jan said, gathering her purse and keys. "Robin's got that math assignment to finish." Lisa nodded, glancing toward the living room where Robin sat cross-legged on the carpet, pencil tapping against her notebook. The 11-year-old looked up and waved, her smile bright and trusting. The house felt secure. Doors would be locked, routines followed, normal life continuing in its predictable rhythm. Outside, neighbors tended gardens and walked dogs. Children's voices carried across the courtyard as parents called them in for dinner. The Courtyards had earned its reputation as a safe haven, a place where people knew each other's names and watched each other's backs. Crime happened elsewhere, in other neighborhoods, to other families. Jan backed out of the driveway, unaware that this ordinary evening would become the last normal moment her family would ever know. The setting sun painted the sky orange and pink as she drove toward the hospital, leaving behind a house that felt like home and would soon become a crime scene. As darkness settled over Cape Coral, the Courtyards complex grew quiet. Porch lights flickered on automatically, casting pools of yellow light across walkways. Most residents had settled in for the evening, television screens glowing through windows, the soft murmur of conversations drifting across courtyards. Inside the Cornell townhouse, Lisa Story and Robin had fallen into their evening routine. Homework finished, dishes done, the sliding glass door remained unlocked, a habit born of trust and Florida's forgiving climate. The door faced a small patio and garden area, screened from view by palm fronds and privacy fencing. Somewhere in the shadows beyond that door, predatory eyes watched and waited. The intruder had chosen his moment carefully. No cars in neighboring driveways, no sounds of activity from adjoining units. The sliding door offered silent entry, no creaking hinges, no jammed locks, no alarms to trigger. He moved with practiced stealth, testing the door until it yielded to gentle pressure. Inside, Lisa had retired to her bedroom, exhausted from her own hospital shift. Robin had brushed her teeth and changed into pajamas, settling into bed with a book. The house breathed peacefully around them, air conditioning humming softly, the distant sound of traffic on nearby streets. Neither heard the door slide open. Neither sensed the presence that crept through their living space, studying the layout, noting escape routes, preparing for violence. The intruder moved like a shadow through rooms that should have been sanctuaries, carrying evil into a space built for safety and love. The clock on the wall ticked past 10 o'clock, then 11. Time moved differently in the darkness, minutes stretching into hours, normal sounds becoming sinister, familiar spaces turning treacherous. Somewhere beyond the walls, night shift workers like Jan Cornell tended to the sick and injured, unaware that predators stalked the very neighborhoods they worked to protect. The attack began in silence. Lisa Story never woke up. The pillow pressed against her face stifled any scream, any struggle, any final prayer. Her killer worked methodically, suffocating the life from someone who had never harmed another soul. The woman who had dedicated her life to healing others died alone in her bedroom, her trust betrayed by a stranger who saw human life as disposable. In the hallway, 11-year-old Robin Cornell heard something, a muffled sound, perhaps, or the subtle shift of floorboards under unfamiliar weight. Children possess instincts adults often lose, primitive warnings that whisper of danger in the dark. She stepped from her bedroom, innocent and curious, moving toward a threat her young mind couldn't comprehend. The blow struck her small face with shocking violence. Robin fell, her world exploding into pain and terror as hands that should have protected instead destroyed. The child who had laughed at dinner just hours before became another victim of predatory rage, her bright future extinguished by someone who felt no connection to human suffering. The intruder worked quickly after that, his violent appetite satisfied, but his violation not yet complete. Both victims were sexually assaulted after death, a final degradation that spoke to depths of depravity beyond normal understanding. This was not crime driven by passion or desperation, but by a calculated cruelty that treated human beings as objects for personal gratification. Throughout the attack, the Courtyards complex slept on. No screams pierced the night air. No neighbors heard breaking glass or running footsteps. The violence occurred in a bubble of terrible silence, contained within walls that should have provided protection but instead became a tomb for innocence and trust. Time passed differently in that house of death. Minutes felt like hours as evil went about its business, reshaping lives and destinies with each calculated act of violence. The killer's work was not finished with murder. Moving through the house like a malevolent spirit, he began a ritual of staging that revealed a mind both organized and deeply disturbed. In the living room, he found photographs of Robin's school pictures, family snapshots, moments of childhood joy captured on film. These he arranged on an ironing board with obsessive precision, creating a macabre gallery that suggested both preparation and perversion. The bathroom became his next stop. Hot water ran as he showered, washing away evidence while leaving behind traces that would later convict him. White socks, carelessly discarded, footprints in places they didn't belong, a horseshoe-shaped Etienne Aigner charm, dropped or deliberately placed among the chaos. 4 keys landed on the floor, house keys, car keys, fragments of normal life scattered like debris from a shattered existence. He pocketed what caught his fancy: Lisa's driver's license, her credit card, a watch that had marked time through a life now ended. These trophies would travel with him into the night, physical reminders of power wielded over the defenseless. The staging revealed a killer who felt comfortable in victim spaces, someone who took time to impose his vision on their final moments. The photographs, arranged with museum-like care, suggested both obsession and ownership, as if Robin's image belonged to him now, her innocence transformed into something twisted and possessive. Outside, Cape Coral slept peacefully. Sprinkler systems activated on lawns, security lights cycled on and off. Night shift workers traveled empty roads, unaware that evil had visited their community and would soon disappear back into the anonymity of suburban Florida. The killer took his time, savoring control, imposing his will on space and memory. When he finally slipped back through that sliding door, he left behind a scene that would haunt investigators for decades, not just for its violence, but for the calculated cruelty that had transformed a family home into a monument to human depravity. Jeanne Cornell's key turned in the deadbolt just after midnight, but the knob wouldn't follow. She tried again, fatigue making her movements clumsy, assuming the lock had jammed from Florida's humidity. Inside, she could hear something: footsteps, perhaps, or the sound of movement where none should exist. The front door finally yielded, swinging open to reveal her home transformed. Furniture seemed different somehow, the air thick with wrongness. Those footsteps she'd heard from outside continued somewhere above her, slow and deliberate, as if someone was walking through her second floor with casual ownership. Jan climbed the stairs with growing dread, each step bringing her closer to a truth that would shatter her world. At the top, she turned toward Lisa's room and saw death waiting in familiar surroundings. Lisa lay motionless, obviously beyond help, her life stolen while Jan worked to save others across town. Robin's room revealed an even more devastating scene. Her daughter lay naked on the bedroom floor, small face, bruised and swollen, innocence destroyed by hands that had shown no mercy. The child who had waved goodbye just hours earlier would never wave again, never laugh, never grow into the woman she might have become. Jan's screams echoed through the Courtyards complex, piercing the night like sirens. Neighbors emerged from their homes, some still in pajamas, drawn by sounds of anguish so raw they seemed to tear holes in reality itself. The peaceful community that had prided itself on safety suddenly confronted violence in its most personal form. Police cars arrived within minutes, their red and blue lights painting the townhouse in emergency colors. Officers secured the scene while paramedics confirmed what Jan already knew: help had come too late. The sliding door stood open like an accusation, its innocuous presence suddenly sinister. By dawn, crime scene tape fluttered in the morning breeze, and the Courtyards complex had lost its innocence forever. Crime scene investigators descended on the Cornell townhouse like an army of scientific soldiers, their mission to transform violence into evidence, chaos into comprehensible narrative. Cameras flashed constantly, documenting every angle, every detail, every piece of physical proof that might someday point toward justice. The forensic team worked methodically through each room, collecting samples of blood, saliva, and genetic material left behind by the killer. Cotton swabs captured DNA from surfaces that looked clean but held microscopic signatures of the intruder's presence. In 1990, this biological evidence represented potential rather than immediate answers. The technology to read genetic fingerprints existed but lacked the databases necessary for identification. Fingerprint powder revealed partial prints on door frames and furniture, but none clear enough for definitive identification. The white socks found in the bathroom went into evidence bags, along with the horseshoe charm, the scattered keys, and photographs that had been arranged with such disturbing care. Footprint impressions in the bathroom showed size and tread patterns, suggesting someone methodical enough to walk through the scene repeatedly. The missing items, Lisa's license, credit card, and watch pointed toward robbery as a possible motive, though the sexual assaults suggested deeper, darker drives. Detective teams began interviewing neighbors immediately. Had anyone seen strangers in the area, heard unusual sounds, noticed vehicles that didn't belong? The Courtyards complex, which had felt like a private oasis just hours before, suddenly seemed porous and vulnerable, full of hiding places and escape routes. The medical examiner arrived to begin the grim process of documenting cause of death. Both victims had been suffocated with pillows, a personal, intimate method of killing that required the killer to watch life drain from their eyes. The sexual assaults had occurred post-mortem, sparing the victims from experiencing that final violation, but adding layers of depravity to an already horrific crime. By afternoon, the entire complex buzzed with activity and speculation, forever changed by one night of evil. The autopsies confirmed what investigators suspected. Both Lisa Story and Robin Cornell had died from suffocation, pillows pressed against their faces until breathing stopped. The medical examiner's reports documented every injury with clinical precision, transforming personal tragedy into legal evidence that would someday face courtroom scrutiny. Both victims had been sexually assaulted after death, a detail that narrowed the suspect profile while expanding the scope of depravity. This was not random violence, but calculated cruelty, suggesting a killer who derived satisfaction from total domination over his victims, even beyond their deaths. Investigators pursued every lead with desperate energy. John Patrick Addis, a known serial offender operating in Florida during that period, became an early suspect. His methods matched some elements of the Cornell Story murders: sexual violence, careful staging, calculated brutality. Detectives interviewed him extensively, comparing his known movements with the timeline of the Cape Coral attacks. But Addis had alibis that held up under scrutiny. Phone records, witness statements, and physical evidence placed him elsewhere during the critical hours. After weeks of investigation, he was eliminated as a suspect, leaving investigators back where they started with abundant evidence but no clear target. The media coverage intensified, community anxiety, local newspapers ran daily updates, television stations featured the story on evening broadcasts, and residents throughout Cape Coral began double-checking locks and installing security systems. Parents who had once let children play freely in courtyards now watched them with hyper-vigilant intensity. Tips poured into the police department, reports of suspicious strangers, unusual vehicles, neighbors who seemed to know too much about the crime. Each lead required investigation, each possibility demanded follow-up, but none yielded the breakthrough investigators desperately needed. As weeks turned to months, the case began its slow migration from active investigation to cold case status. Evidence remained carefully preserved, but leads dried up, media attention faded, and the community gradually adjusted to living with an unsolved double murder in their midst. Years accumulated like sediment over the Cornell Story murders, each one adding distance from the night of violence while preserving its memory in different ways. Evidence boxes sat in climate-controlled storage, their contents unchanged by time but gaining value as technology evolved around them. The DNA samples collected in 1990 represented pure potential genetic signatures, waiting for the tools necessary to read them properly. As the millennium turned, those tools improved dramatically. Database systems expanded, processing speeds increased, and the science of genetic identification transformed from experimental procedure to courtroom standard. In 2005, Florida passed legislation requiring DNA collection from all felony arrestees. Every person booked for serious crimes would provide a genetic sample, feeding a database that grew exponentially with each passing year. The law represented hope for cold case investigators. Thousands of unsolved crimes might find resolution through retrospective comparison. The Cornell Story evidence waited patiently in its controlled environment, preserved with the same care museums use for priceless artifacts. Detectives rotated through assignments, some retiring, others transferring. But the case files remained intact. Periodic reviews checked for new investigative opportunities, new technologies that might unlock old secrets. Cape Coral itself evolved around the unsolved murders. New residents moved into the Courtyards complex, many unaware of its violent history. The townhouse where Lisa and Robin died was cleaned, repaired, and rented to tenants who sometimes felt uneasy without understanding why. Local folklore kept the story alive, whispered warnings about doors left unlocked, cautionary tales told to children who hadn't been born when the killings occurred. Jan Cornell became a reluctant expert on victim advocacy, her personal tragedy transforming into public mission. She attended conferences, lobbied for stronger forensic preservation laws, and kept pressure on investigators to remember her daughter and Lisa. Her persistence ensured the case never truly went cold, it merely hibernated, waiting for the right moment to spring back to life. Lee County Jail processed routine arrests every day, each one following the same bureaucratic procedures that had evolved to handle human failings with maximum efficiency. Joseph Adam Zieler's booking in 2021 for a domestic pellet gun incident seemed unremarkable, another angry man making poor decisions, destined for a brief stay and quick release. The DNA swab taken during processing represented standard protocol under Florida's 2005 law. A simple cotton applicator rubbed against the inside of Zieler's cheek, collecting genetic material that would be processed through CODIS, the combined DNA index system that linked crime labs across the country. Zieler himself appeared unexceptional, a middle-aged man whose life had followed predictable patterns of minor crime and domestic discord. His arrest record showed the usual progression: petty theft, drug possession, domestic disputes that escalated into criminal charges. Nothing in his background suggested capability for the kind of calculated violence that had destroyed the Cornell family, but DNA reveals truth, independent of appearances or assumptions. The genetic material collected from Zieler's cheek carried the same molecular signature left behind in the Cornell townhouse 31 years earlier. When laboratory technicians processed his sample through CODIS, computers began comparing his genetic profile against thousands of unsolved cases stored in the database. The match appeared on computer screens like a digital resurrection, two sets of numbers aligning perfectly across decades, connecting a routine arrest to a double murder that had haunted Cape Coral for a generation. Cold case detectives received the notification with a mixture of excitement and caution, understanding that such matches required careful verification before they could transform possibility into prosecution. Laboratory scientists ran additional tests, confirming and reconfirming the initial results. The DNA profile from Zieler's booking matched genetic material recovered from both victims in 1990. After 31 years of silence, the evidence finally had a name to attach to its accusations. The resurrection of the Cornell Story case had begun. The interrogation room at Lee County Sheriff's Office felt smaller, with Zieler sitting across from detectives who had waited decades for this moment. The man who had lived unknown for 31 years suddenly faced questions about memories he'd assumed were safely buried in the past. Detective presentations began methodically, laying out evidence like cards in a deadly game. DNA results, crime scene photographs, witness statements from 1990. Each piece of information was presented calmly, professionally, giving Zieler opportunities to explain his connection to a double murder that had shocked Cape Coral. Zieler's initial response was predictable denial. He'd never been to the Courtyards complex, never knew Lisa's story or Robin Cornell, had no explanation for how his genetic material ended up at a crime scene 31 years earlier. His voice carried the practiced indignation of someone accustomed to deflecting accusations, but as evidence mounted, his story began to shift. When confronted with the undeniable reality of DNA matches, Zieler offered an alternative explanation that revealed both desperation and calculation. He claimed to have had a sexual relationship with Jan Cornell months before the murders, a consensual encounter that would explain his genetic presence without implicating him in violence. Detectives listened with poker faces, allowing Zieler to construct his defense while mentally cataloging its weaknesses. Jan Cornell had been extensively interviewed in 1990 and had never mentioned any relationship with Zieler. Her statements described her as a single mother focused on work and family, not someone engaged in casual relationships that might compromise her daughter's safety. The interrogation stretched across hours, each question designed to test Zieler's story against verifiable facts. Timelines, locations, phone records, witness statements, every element of his claimed relationship with Jan demanded evidence he couldn't provide. By the session's end, investigators had enough material to begin building a prosecution case that would finally bring the Cornell Story murders to trial. Formal charges against Joseph Adam Zieler read like a catalog of horrors: 2 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of sexual battery, burglary with assault, and later, witness tampering. Each charge carried the weight of decades, transforming a cold case into an active prosecution that would test the durability of 31-year-old evidence. The witness tampering charge emerged from Zieler's behavior while incarcerated, awaiting trial. From his jail cell, he had written threatening letters to Jan Cornell, attempting to intimidate the victim's mother into refusing to testify. The letters revealed a mind that felt entitled to control narrative and memory, someone who believed he could manipulate the justice system through fear and intimidation. Those letters provided prosecutors with additional insight into Zieler's character, a man who felt no remorse for past actions and remained willing to victimize Jan Cornell again to protect himself. The correspondence would become evidence of ongoing criminal intent, showing jurors a defendant who continued threatening behavior even from behind bars. News of the arrest exploded across Cape Coral like a depth charge, awakening memories that many residents had tried to forget. The Courtyards complex found itself surrounded by news trucks and camera crews, residents reluctantly reliving trauma that had shaped their community for over 3 decades. Local media coverage triggered a flood of tips and recollections from people who remembered the original investigation. Some claimed to have seen Zieler in the area during 1990, though such memories required careful verification given the time elapsed. Others offered character testimony, neighbors and acquaintances who described a man capable of violence and deception. The formal charges represented more than legal proceedings. They marked the resurrection of a case that had defined Cape Coral's relationship with safety and trust. After 31 years of wondering, the community finally had a name and face to attach to their collective trauma. The long journey toward justice had officially begun, though its conclusion remained uncertain. Pre-trial hearings transformed a Lee County courtroom into a battlefield where lawyers wielded precedent and procedure like weapons. The central question facing Judge Robert Banning was whether 31-year-old evidence could meet modern legal standards for admissibility and reliability. Defense attorneys attacked every aspect of the case with surgical precision. Chain of custody logs from 1990 required examination had evidence been properly stored, documented, and preserved. Laboratory procedures from 3 decades earlier faced scrutiny. Did DNA collection and analysis methods meet current scientific standards? Witness memories demanded evaluation. Could testimonies about events from 1990 be considered reliable in 2021? Prosecutors countered with meticulous documentation showing how evidence had been preserved in climate-controlled environments, how chain of custody had been maintained through personnel changes and departmental reorganizations, how DNA analysis had been conducted using methods that remained scientifically sound decades later. The horseshoe-shaped Etienne Aigner charm, the white socks, the scattered keys, each physical artifact required verification that it remained unchanged from the night of the murders. Photographs from 1990 were compared against current evidence, demonstrating that items looked identical despite their journey through 3 decades of storage. Laboratory experts testified about DNA degradation and preservation, explaining how genetic material could remain viable for identification purposes even after extended storage. Their testimony established scientific foundation for the prosecution's case while addressing defense challenges about reliability and contamination. Media coverage of pretrial hearings attracted statewide attention, with legal analysts debating whether cold cases could receive fair trials, given the time elapsed between crime and prosecution. The Cornell Story case became a test of whether the justice system could bridge generational gaps to deliver accountability for historical crimes. Judge Banning's rulings on evidence admissibility would determine whether Joseph Zieler faced trial for murders committed when many current jurors were children or not yet born. Jury selection for the Cornell Story trial revealed the challenge of finding impartial citizens in a community that had lived with the unsolved murders for over 30 years. Many potential jurors remembered media coverage from the 1990s, memorial services for the victims, or neighborhood conversations about the case that had never truly disappeared from public consciousness. Defense attorneys questioned each candidate about their ability to consider evidence objectively despite the case's emotional weight. Could they evaluate DNA testimony fairly? Did they understand the burden of proof in capital cases? Could they recommend death sentences if evidence warranted such penalties? Prosecutors faced their own challenges in voir dire, needing jurors who could handle graphic evidence and testimony about child sexual assault without becoming too emotionally compromised to deliberate rationally. The case demanded citizens capable of clinical analysis while maintaining human empathy for victims and their families. Several potential jurors were dismissed after admitting they had already formed opinions about Zieler's guilt based on pre-trial media coverage. Others were excused because they expressed moral opposition to capital punishment, making them unsuitable for a case where prosecutors sought death sentences. The final jury consisted of citizens who ranged in age from young adults who barely remembered the original crime to older residents who had lived through Cape Coral's transformation from shocked community to cautious acceptance of unsolved tragedy. Their diverse backgrounds reflected the case's multi-generational impact. Jury selection consumed days of careful questioning, with each attorney exercising peremptory challenges to shape a panel favorable to their case strategy. The final 12 jurors and alternates represented Cape Coral's cross-section teachers, retirees, healthcare workers, and business owners who would decide whether 31 years of preserved evidence could convict a killer. Their decision would either vindicate decades of patient investigation or demonstrate the limits of time in pursuit of justice. Opening statements in the Joseph Zeeler trial drew stark lines between prosecution and defense narratives, each side offering competing explanations for DNA evidence that had survived 3 decades of storage to accuse a man who had lived freely while his victims lay buried. Prosecutor presentations unfolded like scientific documentaries, walking jurors through forensic timelines that connected Zeeler's genetic material to crime scene evidence with mathematical precision. Laboratory experts had matched 13 genetic markers between his booking sample and material, recovered from both victims. Odds of coincidental matches were calculated in quadrillions, making accidental connection virtually impossible. The prosecution's narrative emphasized the staging elements that distinguish this crime from random violence. Photographs of Robin Cornell arranged on an ironing board with museum-like precision suggested a killer who took time to impose his vision on the scene. The stolen items, Lisa's license, credit card, and watch pointed towards someone who collected trophies from his victims. Defense attorneys countered with their alternative DNA transfer theory, suggesting Zeeler's genetic material reached the crime scene through his claimed sexual relationship with Jan Cornell months before the murders. They argued that consensual contact could explain forensic evidence without proving murder, creating reasonable doubt about his guilt despite the scientific matches. The courtroom atmosphere felt charged with decades of accumulated emotion. Jan Cornell sat in the front row, her presence serving as living reminder of the human cost behind forensic abstractions. Community members filled available seats, many remembering the original investigation and its failure to bring closure. Media coverage intensified as opening statements revealed the prosecution's strategy of using preserved evidence to build an airtight case. Defense challenges to that evidence would test whether 31 years of patient preservation could withstand modern legal scrutiny. The trial that Cape Coral had waited decades to see was finally underway. Prosecution witnesses testified with clinical precision about evidence that had waited 31 years for courtroom presentation. Forensic experts explained DNA analysis methodologies, laboratory procedures that had extracted genetic signatures from biological material collected in 1990 and preserved through technological evolution. The 13 matching genetic markers between Zeeler's booking sample and crime scene evidence represented mathematical certainty that transcended reasonable doubt. Laboratory technicians described how genetic degradation occurs over time, how proper preservation prevents contamination, how modern analysis could read molecular signatures that 1990 technology couldn't interpret. Jan Cornell's testimony provided emotional counterpoint to scientific abstractions. She described returning home from her hospital shift to find deadbolts that wouldn't turn properly, footsteps echoing from upstairs rooms, the horrifying discovery of Lisa and Robin's bodies. Her voice remained steady throughout, questioning 31 years of grief transformed into determined pursuit of justice. Crime scene investigators testified about evidence collection procedures, chain of custody protocols, storage methods that had preserved physical artifacts across 3 decades of personnel changes and technological advancement. The horseshoe charm, white socks, and scattered keys remained exactly as found in 1990, unchanged by time and ready for courtroom presentation. Medical examiner testimony documented causes of death with clinical precision. Both victims had been suffocated with pillows, sexually assaulted post-mortem, positioned in ways that suggested the killer had spent considerable time arranging the scene to his satisfaction. The methodical nature of the violence pointed toward calculated cruelty rather than impulsive crime. Defense cross-examination challenged every aspect of evidence, preservation, and analysis, seeking inconsistencies that might create reasonable doubt. But decades of careful documentation had anticipated such challenges, creating paper trails that verified every step from initial collection through modern laboratory analysis. The prosecution's case built methodically toward scientific inevitability, DNA evidence that demanded explanation from someone who claimed no connection to the victims. Defense testimony centered on Zeeler's alternative explanation for his genetic presence at the Cornell crime scene, a claimed sexual relationship with Jan Cornell that supposedly occurred months before the murders. His story required jurors to believe that consensual contact could explain forensic evidence found on both victims. Under oath, Zeeler described meeting Jan Cornell through unspecified social circumstances, developing a brief intimate relationship that ended before the May 1990 murders. He claimed the DNA matches resulted from genetic material transferred from Jan to her home environment, then to other occupants, through normal household contact. Prosecutors systematically dismantled this narrative through timeline analysis and witness testimony. Jan Cornell had been extensively interviewed in 1990 and had never mentioned any relationship with Zeeler. Her work schedules, social activities, and personal habits were documented through police reports that showed no connection to the defendant. Character witnesses called by the defense offered little compelling testimony about Zeeler's whereabouts during the critical period. His alibi for the night of May 9–10, 1990, remained vague and unverifiable, consisting mainly of claims about being at home or visiting friends who couldn't provide specific memories after 3 decades. The defense strategy revealed its fundamental weakness during cross-examination. Zeeler couldn't explain how genetic material from a supposed months-old relationship could appear on victims he claimed never to have met. DNA transfer requires direct contact, not environmental persistence across extended time periods. His courtroom demeanor began revealing character traits that supported prosecution arguments about his capacity for violence. Hostile responses to questioning, dismissive attitudes toward victims' families, and barely controlled anger suggested someone capable of the calculated cruelty described in evidence. As defense testimony concluded, Zeeler's alternative explanation appeared increasingly implausible compared to the straightforward narrative of guilt supported by 31 years of preserved evidence. Joseph Zeeler's courtroom behavior escalated during trial proceedings, revealing personality traits that supported prosecution arguments about his character and capacity for violence. His transformation from quiet defendant to hostile spectacle occurred gradually, then explosively, as evidence mounted against him. Initially, Zeeler had maintained composure during witness testimony, occasionally conferring with defense attorneys or taking notes about witness statements, but as DNA evidence accumulated and his alternative explanations crumbled under scrutiny, his demeanor shifted toward barely controlled hostility. The first public outburst occurred during Jan Cornell's testimony, when Zeeler called her a pig loudly enough for the entire courtroom to hear. Judge Banning immediately admonished him about proper courtroom behavior, but the damage was done. Jurors had witnessed his capacity for cruelty toward the victim's grieving mother. His behavior became increasingly theatrical as trial proceedings continued. During one session, he used black marker to write "killer" across his teeth, displaying the word prominently when called upon to speak. The bizarre spectacle revealed a mind that sought attention through shock value rather than engaging seriously with legal proceedings. Court security increased their vigilance around Zeeler as his outbursts became more frequent and unpredictable. His defense attorneys struggled to control their clients' behavior while maintaining professional standards for capital case representation. The culminating moment of his courtroom misconduct occurred during sentencing proceedings, when Zeeler physically assaulted his own attorney, elbowing the man in the face during official court business. Security personnel immediately restrained him, but the violent outburst provided final confirmation of his capacity for sudden, unprovoked aggression. These behavioral exhibitions served as real-time demonstrations of the violent personality that had allegedly destroyed the Cornell family 31 years earlier. Jurors witnessed firsthand the kind of uncontrolled hostility that could escalate into lethal violence. Jury deliberations consumed 3 days of intense discussion as 12 citizens wrestled with evidence that spanned technological generations and demanded verdicts that could result in death sentences. Their task required evaluating scientific testimony that most laypeople struggled to understand, while considering emotional testimony about victims whose deaths had haunted their community for decades. The DNA evidence presented mathematical certainty that transcended reasonable doubt. 13 genetic markers matching between Zeeler's booking sample and crime scene material represented odds calculated in quadrillions. Defense arguments about alternative DNA transfer required jurors to accept implausible scenarios that strained credibility beyond breaking points. Deliberation discussions revealed how jurors processed complex forensic information alongside compelling emotional testimony. The methodical staging of crime scene evidence photographs arranged with obsessive precision, victims positioned according to the killer's vision suggested calculated cruelty that supported premeditation arguments. Zeeler's courtroom behavior had provided real-time demonstrations of his capacity for sudden violence and hostility toward victims' families. His assault on his own attorney during proceedings eliminated any lingering doubts about his propensity for unprovoked aggression. The defense's alternative explanation required believing that Jan Cornell had concealed a sexual relationship during extensive police interviews in 1990, that genetic material could persist in household environments for months, and that coincidental DNA transfer could explain evidence found on both victims. Such scenarios strained credibility beyond what reasonable people could accept. On the third day, deliberations concluded with unanimous verdicts that had been mathematically inevitable since DNA evidence was first presented. The genetic signatures that had waited 31 years for technological interpretation had finally spoken with scientific authority that brooked no contradiction. Foreman announcements of guilt on both counts of first-degree murder brought closure. That Cape Coral had awaited for over 3 decades, guilty of murder in the first degree. The words echoed through Judge Robert Banning's courtroom with the finality of mathematical proof, ending 31 years of uncertainty with scientific certainty that admitted no doubt. Joseph Adam Zieler sat motionless as verdicts were read for both Lisa Story and Robin Cornell. 2 lives stolen, 2 families shattered, 2 murder convictions that would determine whether he lived or died. Jan Cornell's tears reflected relief mixed with sorrow, justice delivered but arriving too late to restore what had been lost. The daughter who would never grow up, the friend who had died protecting her, their deaths finally carried legal consequence. But the verdicts couldn't resurrect the dead or return the decades stolen from those who loved them. Outside the courthouse, Cape Coral residents gathered in clusters, sharing memories of a case that had defined their community's relationship with safety and trust. Some had moved to the area after 1990, learning the story through neighborhood whispers and local folklore. Others remembered the original investigation, the fear that had settled over their streets, the gradual resignation to living with unsolved violence. The guilty verdicts represented more than legal conclusions. They marked the end of a community's long nightmare, the resolution of questions that had haunted dinner conversations and bedtime routines for over 30 years. Children who had been forbidden to play outside after dark could finally understand why their parents had seemed so afraid of shadows and unlocked doors. Media coverage exploded across social platforms and evening broadcasts, carrying news of resolution to audiences who had followed the case through documentaries, true crime podcasts, and anniversary remembrances. The Cornell Story murders had become a symbol of cold case persistence, proof that DNA evidence could bridge decades to deliver justice when human memory failed. But verdicts only represented the beginning of Zieler's legal reckoning. Florida law required separate penalty phase proceedings to determine whether his crimes warranted death sentences, a process that would force jurors to weigh aggravating factors against possible mitigation, deciding whether the state should claim his life in return for the lives he had taken. The courtroom that had witnessed decades of preserved evidence finally speaking would soon determine whether that evidence demanded the ultimate penalty. The penalty phase of Joseph Zieler's trial transformed legal proceedings into moral reckoning, where prosecutors and defense attorneys battled over the value of human life and the proper response to calculated evil. Florida's death penalty statute required jurors to weigh aggravating factors against mitigating circumstances, balancing the horror of crimes against any reasons for mercy. Prosecutors presented aggravating factors with methodical precision. The murders had been especially heinous, atrocious, and cruel. Children sexually assaulted after death, crime scenes staged with obsessive precision, victims chosen for their vulnerability. The killings were committed during the commission of burglary, adding legal weight to penalty calculations. Premeditation appeared evident in the careful staging of evidence, the collection of trophies, the time spent arranging photographs with museum-like care. These were not crimes of passion but calculated acts of violence that revealed a mind capable of extended cruelty. The victims' ages added emotional weight to aggravating factors. Robin Cornell had been 11 years old, her entire future stolen by someone who saw childhood innocence as opportunity for exploitation. Lisa Story had died, trying to protect a child, her nurturing instincts transformed into fatal vulnerability. Defense attorneys offered mitigation testimony about Zieler's background, seeking any factors that might argue against death sentences. Mental health experts testified about possible psychological disorders. Social workers described disadvantaged childhood circumstances. Family members pleaded for mercy despite acknowledging his crimes. But mitigation evidence struggled against the overwhelming brutality of the murders and Zieler's continuing hostility toward victims' families. His courtroom behavior had provided real-time demonstrations of the violent personality that had allegedly destroyed 2 innocent lives. After deliberating the penalty recommendations, jurors returned unanimous decisions that death sentences were appropriate for both murders. Their verdict reflected community judgment that some crimes transcend the possibility of rehabilitation or redemption. Judge Robert Banning's sentencing hearing represented the final act of a legal drama that had consumed Cape Coral's attention for months while resolving questions that had haunted the community for decades. The courtroom was packed with residents who had lived through the original investigation, the years of uncertainty, and now the resolution that science had finally provided. Banning reviewed the jury's unanimous recommendations for death sentences with the gravity appropriate to such momentous decisions. Florida law required judicial review of penalty phase verdicts, ensuring that death sentences reflected proper application of legal standards rather than emotional responses to heinous crimes. The aggravating factors clearly supported the jury's recommendations. Both murders had been especially heinous, atrocious, and cruel, involving sexual assault of victims after death and careful staging that revealed calculated cruelty. The crimes occurred during burglary commission, satisfying additional statutory requirements for capital punishment. Zieler's behavior during trial proceedings had eliminated any lingering doubts about his character or capacity for rehabilitation. His hostility toward victims' families, his theatrical courtroom antics, and his physical assault on his own attorney had provided real-time demonstrations of the violent personality that had destroyed 2 innocent lives. The moment of sentencing arrived with ceremonial solemnity. Judge Banning pronounced 2 death sentences, one for Lisa Story, one for Robin Cornell, formally condemning Zieler to execution for murders that had traumatized a community and shattered a family. The sentences represented legal conclusion to 31 years of patient investigation and scientific advancement. But even as Banning spoke the words that would send Zieler to death row, the courtroom erupted into final chaos. Zieler, true to form, elbowed his attorney in the face during the sentencing proceedings, requiring immediate intervention by court security. His violent outburst provided fitting punctuation to proceedings that had revealed his fundamental character. Joseph Adam Zieler's transfer to Union Correctional Institution marked the beginning of his residency on Florida's death row, where condemned inmates await execution while their cases navigate the complex appeals process that can extend for decades. His violent courtroom behavior had eliminated any public sympathy that might have complicated his legal journey towards state-sanctioned death. Jan Cornell faced news cameras outside the courthouse with dignity that had sustained her through 31 years of grief and uncertainty. Her statement reflected relief, mixed with sorrow. Justice had finally arrived, but it couldn't restore her daughter's laughter or Lisa's friendship. The verdicts provided closure without resurrection, legal satisfaction without emotional healing. Robin would have been 42 years old now, Jan said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of decades spent imagining futures that would never unfold. She would have had children of her own, a career, a life full of joy and purpose. Lisa would have continued helping people, healing the sick, making the world better. Nothing can bring them back, but at least now we know who stole their futures. The community response revealed how deeply the case had affected Cape Coral's collective psyche. Residents who had spent decades checking locks twice, warning children about strangers, and living with low-level anxiety about unsolved violence suddenly felt lighter, as if atmospheric pressure had finally lifted. Local media coverage emphasized the role of advanced forensic science in solving cold cases that had once seemed permanently closed. The Cornell Story murders became a symbol of persistence rewarded, proof that DNA evidence could bridge generational gaps to deliver justice when human memory failed. Defense attorneys immediately filed appeals, challenging various aspects of the conviction and sentencing, beginning a legal process that would likely consume years before reaching final resolution. Zieler would spend those years in solitary confinement, his life reduced to concrete walls and legal briefs, while his victims' families continued their healing journey. The legacy of the Cornell Story case extended far beyond individual justice, becoming a cornerstone of cold case investigation methodology and DNA database expansion. Law enforcement agencies across Florida cited the case as justification for evidence preservation protocols and database enhancement funding. Cape Coral's memorial services for Lisa Story and Robin Cornell continued annually, drawing residents who remembered the original investigation and newcomers who learned the story through community participation. The victims' names were inscribed on memorial plaques that reminded visitors about lives stolen and eventually avenged through scientific advancement. Forensic preservation techniques developed during the Cornell Story investigation influenced evidence storage protocols at crime labs throughout the region. The case demonstrated how properly maintained biological samples could remain viable for identification purposes across multiple decades, encouraging other agencies to invest in climate-controlled storage facilities. Police academies incorporated the case into training curricula about cold case investigation, DNA evidence handling, and community relations during extended investigations. Young officers learned how patience and proper procedure could eventually deliver justice even when initial investigations failed to identify perpetrators. The Florida Department of Law Enforcement used the case to advocate for expanded DNA database requirements, arguing that earlier collection of Zieler's genetic material might have solved the murders years sooner. Legislative discussions about database expansion frequently referenced the Cornell Story resolution as evidence of such systems' crime-solving potential. Jan Cornell became an advocate for victims' rights and cold case investigation funding, speaking at conferences and supporting legislation that strengthened forensic preservation requirements. Her personal tragedy transformed into public mission, ensuring that other families might receive faster resolution than her 31-year wait for answers. The sliding glass door that had provided Zeeler's entry point became a symbol throughout Cape Coral, reminding residents that security requires constant vigilance and that evil can enter the most innocent spaces. On warm May evenings in Cape Coral, when Gulf Coast breezes carry the scent of salt water and blooming jasmine, residents of the Courtyards complex sometimes gather for informal memorial services that honor lives stolen and justice delayed but not denied. Candles flicker in the gathering darkness, creating pools of golden light that push back shadows while voices speak names that refuse to be forgotten. Lisa Story, someone says quietly, and the assembled crowd responds with memories of a woman who dedicated her life to healing others, whose trust and kindness made her vulnerable to predatory evil. Robin Cornell, another voice continues, summoning recollections of an 11-year-old girl whose bright future was extinguished by hands that showed no mercy to innocence. The annual gatherings serve multiple purposes: remembrance for the dead, healing for the living, and community affirmation that some stories transcend individual tragedy to become collective memory. Children who weren't born when the murders occurred listen to their parents describe a time when Cape Coral lived in fear, when unsolved violence cast shadows over every unlocked door and unguarded moment. Palm trees rustle overhead, their fronds whispering secrets to the Florida night, while LED candles cast dancing patterns on townhouse walls. The sliding glass door that once provided entry for evil has been replaced multiple times, but its symbolic presence lingers in community consciousness, a reminder that security requires eternal vigilance and that monsters sometimes hide behind ordinary faces. Jan Cornell often attends these gatherings, her presence serving as living bridge between past tragedy and present peace. At 73, she carries herself with dignity, earned through decades of grief, transformed into purposeful advocacy. Her voice remains steady when she speaks about Robin and Lisa, about justice delayed but finally delivered, about the importance of never forgetting those who cannot speak for themselves. The evening ends as it always does, with silence that honors the dead, an acknowledgement that time heals some wounds while preserving others as eternal reminders of human fragility and resilience.